So, Malcolm Guite is a poet and a priest and life fellow at Girton College, Cambridge. He lives in Norfolk, from where he's come down today, and he lectures very widely in England and North America on theology and literature. He has written about 20 books. We have many of them, Jane and I have many of them, so they're at the back for you to have a look at. Please don't take them, they're ours, inscribed to us by Malcolm. But he has also brought some of his books for sale. So Jane is going to stay by the book table, and if you want to buy some of his books, especially after prayer, which is going to be completely relevant for today, they are down there. And you can pay with cash, or you can pay by backs if you haven't brought cash. As many of you know, he also writes for the Church Times. You may be interested to know that one of his poems, one of my favourite of his poems, Refugee, was used by King Charles at his Christmas service. And lastly, I discovered in our journey here that he is a YouTuber. Do some of you watch him on YouTube?
Oh, yeah.
Some of his YouTube, whatever they call them, has had more than 1 million views. How about that? Well, I'm going to subscribe at the end of today. So we pray for all of you that you will have an inspiring day that deepens and widens your and our prayer lives. And I do thank Malcolm very much indeed for being with us.
Press my button.
Hello, I'm audible now, I hope. What a pleasure it is to be here. It's nice to be doing something with Catherine and Jane after. It's quite a long break. We were thinking it's about 14 years. I used to come and do things for you at Big Hall. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for showing up. I've called the day Poetry and Prayer, and I'm going to think about a little bit about the interlap between those things, and we're going to look at how poetry might deepen or clarify or help our prayer life. And we're going to be particularly reflecting on a poem by George Herbert, which is helpfully called Prayer. So if you're going to have the poetry prayer in a second, you might as well have a poem called Prayer. That'd be our main focus. But I'm going to introduce it slightly more obliquely through another favourite poem of mine, James Heaney. But before I do that, maybe I should just say something about poetry itself. I'm guessing because you're all volunteers and not pressing, you weren't totally put off by the word poetry. But I've sometimes addressed groups of people, particularly the men sometimes, who think, oh my goodness, poetry, I just keep my head down and nobody asks me anything. Sometimes people have an as it were, poetry anxiety. This is usually because they're somewhere, on the edge of their memory is the ghost of a bad English teacher who made them think that they couldn't do poetry. It wasn't for them. Their first tentative answer, was stamped on and no. And all the very kinds of responses that poetry should be kindling were sort of squashed in the classroom. I don't know if you ever had that kind of teacher. I mean, you can have the opposite. You can have a teacher who gives the love of poetry, shares it with you. I mean, I was that scruffy English teacher, but I taught in a comprehensive school for 5 years. But that kind of teacher, there's a wonderful poem by the American poet Billy Collins where he records that dreadful English lesson. And he says, her idea of how to do poetry was to tie the poem to a chair and beat it with a hose pipe till it confessed what it meant. And he says, by contrast, I want to put my ear up to the murmuring and murmuring of the poem and wonder what honey the innumerable bees of its words were making. So, two different approaches. So I feel, when I do this in a large group, I don't necessarily know, I sometimes feel I have to start with a minor exorcism and say that if the unrested shade of the English teacher who made you feel inadequate about poetry happens to be lingering somewhere on the borders of your mind, I say to that unrested shade, depart, go to the place appointed for you and never return. So that's the teacher in permanent detention, and now we can enjoy playtime. So, we're going to enjoy some poetry. I once had the joy of interviewing the Nobel laureate James Heaney after he won the Wilfred Owen Memorial Prize, and we talked about how poetry, when does a poem become a poem for you? Well, it's obviously not when the book is closed, but even when the book is open and you're reading the poem flat in the black and white things on the page, perhaps silently in your head, it's not quite a poem yet. If you speak it out loud and breathe it into being, it's becoming a bit more of a poem. But he reckoned that the poem really comes into its own when you're not thinking about poetry at all, when you've read a particular poem and absorbed it so deeply that you're in some other situation in life at all. You're walking, you're talking with a friend, you're facing a dilemma, and suddenly a phrase from the poem pops into your mind and clarifies things for you. Let's say you're in a place of confusion and you're seeing, what can I hang on to in life, what can I steer by? And suddenly Shakespeare's phrase about love, about the marriage of true minds comes to it, and he says, it is an ever-fixed mark. It is a star to every wandering mark. And you think, oh, I can re-navigate, I can find the real key point in my soul. Perhaps you're in some other situation and you're looking at a view or a sunset, and you have this feeling as you watch the sunset and the clouds that there's something more, that it's almost something behind the sun. And a phrase of Wordsworth's comes to you. He says, a sense of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns. And the poem, you didn't think, I'm now going to think about Wordsworth. The poem came to you because it was part of who you are, and it clarified. So he said to me that that's when a poem is a poem, when a phrase comes and offers what he called a fleeting clarification, a glimpse of potential order, a glimpse that has to be its own reward. And then he concluded what he had to say with something I've stayed with me ever since. He said, I don't know if nowadays people memorize poems anyway. I don't know if my poems will ever be remembered whole. But I hope some phrases from them will. And then he concluded this part of what he was saying by saying, at its best, I hope my poetry can offer phrases that feed the soul. Phrases that feed the soul. And the most important thing I would say at the beginning of this all is, I hope that by the end of the day, you will go home with some phrases that feed your soul. When I read a whole poem, don't think, oh God, it was too quick, I didn't get it. Don't worry about trying to comprehend the whole poem. Just go for the phrases. And that's why I'm particularly going to focus on George Herbert's poem, Prayer. It's a sonnet, but it's not a sentence. It actually just is a list of phrases. It goes straight for the gold nuggets and gives it to you. There's no rocket, it's all pure gold. One phrase after another about what prayer is. So we'll get to that. But I give you handouts partly because I can't work with projectors. I rejoice to be in a church that hasn't got one. But partly because the thing is, you can't go and write your notes on the screen. Whereas if you've got a piece of paper, you can write something, you can take it home. In fact, I've got some potential looking prayer exercises and discernment exercises on here. So I hope you'll take this home. And at the very least, when they come, when the phrases come that seem to mean something for you, that you want to chew on and be fed by, just hold on. Then you can take a piece of paper home for your mind. Plus, if you yourself are somebody who perhaps runs a home group or a prayer group or some, spiritual exploration group, go and use this. Go and, if the poem has worked for you and you'd like to help it work for anybody else, there's a handout. You can use it and you can reproduce it, and I should say that.
Can you just check everyone's got one?
Has everyone got a handout?
Marvellous.
Hooray. So I think I should say as well, when I first published my collection, Sounding the Seasons, the cycle of sonnets for the Christian year, I'd already begun to write them. Obviously, I'd written most of them before I finally got the book contract. And I began began to post them on my blog, and I realised that people find them helpful in sermons and things like that. So when I did sign my contract with Canterbury Press, I actually said to my editor, Christine Smith, I said, look, these poems arose out of my life in a church, a particular church in Cambridge, and I wrote them to be at the service of the church. And I want churches and prayer groups and Christians to feel free to use these poems, to photocopy them, to download them from the web or whatever, and to share them in the church and in their activities without having to have a separate copyright permission. So again, there's a poem of mine in this handout. Just go ahead, and do that also with any poems of mine that you find that you want to use in different church contexts. So now, I said we come at the George Herbert poem a little bit obliquely, and I'm going to do it through a Shakespearean poem. And I begin with this Shakespearean poem because of one of the phrases in it that happens to feed my soul, and which really, without which I wouldn't be doing this day with you. Contained in this unique poem is the phrase, indeed the piece of advice, read poems as prayers. And I have to say, when I read that in the late 80s, and I was wrestling with, do I have mainly a vocation as a writer? Do I have a vocation as a priest? I had my prayer life in one corner and my poetry life in another, and I'd never really thought. And read poems as prayers. And that's really interesting, because obviously some poems are prayers. Some hymns started just as poems. When all thy mercies, O my God, my rising soul surveys, transported with thee, and lost in wonder, love and praise, was a poem called Thankfulness by Addison, which then became various Shakespeare and various George Herbert poems. So easy to read a poem that's already a prayer as a prayer. But how do you read other poems as prayers? Well, maybe you read them with a sense that God is in the room with you, perhaps particularly Christ or the Holy Spirit, and the Lord, the Word, through whom the whole world came into being. The triune poet who speaks existence, for whom the cosmos is the poem he's still making, is reading a poem over your shoulder. Read it in his presence. It doesn't have to be a sacred poem, it could be a secular poem. It could be a poem that you want to be in conversation with. It could be a poem that's wrestling with faith in a way that you might be at a given particular point. It's really interesting to read, for example, Larkin's great poem, Philip Larkin's great poem, Church Going, in a church, with a sense of the presence of God. Because that poem starts with Larkin fiercely saying, of course I don't believe any of this nonsense, and it's got the most unpromising opening of one of the most unpromising openings of any English poem. Just, you may remember that poem begins, once I'm sure there's nothing going on inside, I let the door third shut. And there's like nothing to see here. I'm just interested in church architecture, he says. I think he doesn't protest too much, because then you remember a classic moment of it couldn't be more English line than this. He says, hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Awkward reverence. And then he tries again to say, oh, no, I don't believe it. And he starts saying, up at the holy end, But then after saying up at the holy end, he says, a tense, musty, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long. And so the poem goes back and forth, is there anything here? And then he says, oh no, nothing. He says, I donated Irish sixpence and reflect the place was not worth stopping for. If that could be the end of the poem, it's not the poem, but yet stop I did. In fact, I often do. Why do I keep going to church? And then he says that beautiful thing at the end of the poem, a serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies in the house. That's the end of the poem that starts, nothing going on. But you read that in a church, it's interesting. You read that as a way always going around. through. So read poems as prayers. So I didn't mean to talk about Larkin and Joyce, I'm talking just not distracting. But I mean, how nice to read or recite, remember part of a poem about a church, in a church which I believe is indeed the subject, or is gathered into a Betjeman poem. But let's turn back to Heaney. How is it that Heaney comes to include this phrase, read poems as prayers, in a poem? Well, the phrase, read poems as prayers, which we'll come to in this poem in a minute, is something that Heaney heard a priest say to him, indeed a monk say to him, from behind the grill of a confessional. So, very interesting. I don't know if the monk realised that he had Seamus Heaney on the other side of his confessional or not. But, so, the poem I'm going to read you now is simply called Station Island 11, and it's part of a sequence of 12 poems called Station Island. Came out in a book called Station Island, came out in the mid or late 80s. Just along, the whole of Northern Irish travels from, nowhere to scarce. Station Island is a place of retreat and penance. It's known colloquially as Patrick's Purgatory, and it's an island in Loch Derg. And Heaney has done the Station Island pilgrimage, the Loch Derg pilgrimage, 3 times. So the poem is a bit of a distillation of that. It's hardcore pilgrimages. You fast. You go around these different stations or beds, barefoot, and you fast over the 3 days that you're on the island. You get to drink water and you have 1 piece of dried toast a day, So it's pretty hardcore. And in Heaney's poem, while he's on this purgation, this thing, he has a series of encounters, each of which has a poem, with figures either from his own personal past or from Ireland's past, in which he unflinchingly interrogates, as it called, questions into the womb that is Ireland, in the womb that is, all those troubles, all those cycles. And so you can imagine it's pretty bleak. And it kind of gets darker and darker. He's daring to face it. That's what a retreat is about. Until finally, in number 10, the one just before this, he says, my feet touched bottom. It gets down to the worst of it. And then, at the end of the poem number 10, he tells the story of Ronan and the altar. So this is a lovely Celtic Christianity story about a monk called Ronan who has a beautiful book of Psalms, a beautiful psalter, and he's reading it to a pagan Irish king, hoping to convert him through poetry, of course, because the Psalms is poetry. And the king, infuriated, grabs the psalter and throws it into the waters of the loch, the same loch, in fact, and it disappears. And Ronan is completely unperturbed about the drowning of everything, and he whistles, and immediately a sea otter comes up with the book of Psalms in its mouth and waddles onto the shore and gives it back to Ronan. And it's been not simply preserved, it's been completely cleansed and renewed. It's pristine, it's beautiful. And Ronan carries on from where he left off, and the king's quite impressed, So now he tells that story about something that's kind of gone down, and the whole thing has been about dark, murky depths. And then he tells the story about recovery. And that's the poem before this. So now we're going to come to this poem. One last little thing to help you. There are 2 memories embedded in this poem. One is an early memory of Heaney as a little boy on the farm in County Down where he was brought up on. He was one of 10 kids. You can imagine, all the dangers of the farmyard. Poor Mrs. Heaney looking after these 10 kids. And he writes a poem, say, as a child they couldn't keep me away from water. And he loved wells and ditches and, he was always kind of, jumping into lakes and edges and ditches. And they had people about him. So in the story, he remembers having been given, maybe it was a birthday present or something, he was given a kaleidoscope. And he's running around looking at everything, just seeing beautiful things. And he thinks to himself, wouldn't it be, I wonder what it's like if I plunge my kaleidoscope into this butt of muddy water. And of course, it's ruined and silted. He must never have forgotten that. That's one memory. And then the other memory is a memory of having made confession to this monk. Now, I'll read it for you, just enjoy it. You maybe think, and I'll read it. It's a great thing, you get 2 poems for the price of 1 here, because he not only tells you about the confession, he tells you about the penance he was asked to do. The very same monk who said, read poems as prayers, says, feel penance. Translate me something by Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross. I mean, if you knew you had Eni on the other side, you would do this. I feel penance, I'd like you to write me a personal poem. So we get the poem as well. Let's just hear the story as Eni tells it, and I hope you'll see why I want to come to her through this. Okay, station 11. As if the prisms of the kaleidoscope I plunged once in a butt of muddy water surface like a marvellous light ship, and out of its silted crystals a monk's face that had spoken years ago from behind a grill spoke again about the need and chance to salvage everything, to re-envisage the zenith and glimpsed jewels of any gift mistakenly abased. What came to nothing could always be replenished. Read poems as prayers, he said, and for your penance, translate me something by Juan de la Cruz. Returned from Spain to our chapped wilderness, his consonants aspirate, his forehead shining, he had made me feel there was nothing to confess. Now his sandaled passage stirred me on to this. How well I know that fountain, filling, running, although it is the night. That eternal fountain hidden away, I know its haven and its secrecy, although it is the night, but not its source, because it does not have one, which is all sources' source and origin, although it is the night. No other thing can be so beautiful. Here the earth and heaven drink their fill, although it is the night. So pellucid, it never can be muddied. And I know that all light radiates from it, although it is the night. I know no sounding line can find its bottom, nobody ford or plumb its deepest fathom, although it is the night. And its current, so in flood, it overspills to water hell and heaven and all peoples, although it is the night. And the current that is generated there, as far as it wills to, it can flow that far, although it is the night. And from these two, a third current proceeds, which neither of these two, I know, precedes, although it is the night. This eternal fountain hides and splashes within this living bread that is life to us, although it is the night. Hear it calling out to every creature, and they drink these waters, although it is dark here because it is the night. I am repining for this living fountain. Within this bread of life, I see it play, although it is the night. So, you get the 2 poems for the price of one there. Astonishing. It's a beautiful poem, although it's the night, Ancora Noche, by John of the Cross. We know, most people have heard of John of the Cross through the phrase, which is also the title of one of his works, The Dark Night of the Sun. And he is definitely the poet who has been into and through a kind of desolation and void and emptiness, and found that even there God hasn't let him go, even though he feels as though he might have done. And he lived in the dark, of course, because he was actually persecuted by his own order, and they locked him up into the basements and just took him out occasionally to beat him, so he visible or even anything but spiritual darkness, all kinds of darkness. But through all this, he wrote these amazing love songs to God, really. I mean, he speaks of his darkness sometimes as his I'm a lover who's so in love, I'm awake before dawn and I'm going out. I know dawn's coming out, but I'm not here yet. But in this pre-dawn dark, I've gone out to look for my beloved. So he's an amazing poet. So let me just go back to the first part of it, the scene setting by Heaney. Okay, the scenario clearly is somebody making confession and receiving absolution. And we do get the word grill and confessional, you know. We don't say confession, just behind the grill. The first thing I want to notice is that if this is about sin and absolution, it does the thing that poetry can do very well. It completely avoids the technical cliche language of the church, which can be so off-putting to so many people. I don't see the word sin anywhere here. I don't see the word absolution. I don't even see the sacrament of reconciliation or any of the other terms we want to use. What I see instead is an image that helps me understand what's really going on. And the image is the image of the kaleidoscope. I was given something beautiful and I ruined it. I ruined it because I was using it for the wrong thing or not seeing right, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, honestly. So, as if the prisms of the kaleidoscope I plunged once in a butt of muddy water surfaced again, and now the kaleidoscope has become this light ship. Now he's going on a voyage into light. The whole poem is going to be about the recovery of light. In the end, the penance is going to be about saying, even when it's at its darkest, that light is still there, although it is the night. And although it is the night, actually, it becomes a great word of hope. Because if I say, although it is dark here, because it is the night, then it doesn't mean that's the permanent void darkness of space with no light in it. On the contrary, if it's the night, then the morning is coming. That's what I mean when I say the night. Heaviness may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Yeah. So, as it were, he imagines this gift that he, mistakenly ruined and abased, rising again. And out of the risen thing, the ruined kaleidoscope is cleansed. Its silted crystals are silted no longer. It's once again a vision. It's this marvelous light ship. And then the monk's face. And the words, he remembers the words, spoke again about the need and chance to salvage everything, to re-envisage the zenith and glimpsed jewels of any gift mistakenly abased. What came to nothing could always be replenished. Now I think that's probably one of the best ways of thinking, the best accounts of what we, in the easily misunderstood shorthand of the church, call sin. A gift mistakenly abased, but something which both needs to be salvaged and has a chance of salvage. And if you think about it, this is what Augustine teaches in the end. Everything is good to begin with. God creates everything. He sees that it is really good. He blesses it. Yeah? We start with goodness. The phrase original sin is actually a very inaccurate misnomer. The original thing is goodness. Sin itself only becomes possible when a good thing is bent awry, when a good thing is somehow spoiled from within. And the better the thing is, the worse it is when it's abused, which is why, religious wars are so particularly hideous, and, bigotry in the name of religion is so particularly hideous. The thing has to be good first. But the better it is, the worse it can become if it's not, if it is mistakenly or otherwise abased, yeah? That's why Shakespeare says, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Yeah? So, the need and chance to salvage everything, any gift mistakenly abased. Now, if you were to think about sin, and just think for a moment about bring me down here, but think for a moment in the privacy of your own head about what you might consider to be your besetting sins. if you do make confession to anybody, the things that just keep cropping up again and again is like, am I not done with this? Unbelievable. You know, if you think about your besetting sins, I'm willing to bet that your besetting sins, such as they are very closely linked to your charisms and gifts. Their shadows cast by your charisms and gifts, right? So, if you happen to be, a sort of warm-hearted and convivial person, and your gift, let's say, is hospitality, or your gift is a kind of warmth and welcome, then your besetting sins will probably be the warm-blooded and indulgent sins. And likewise, if you're somebody who's got a real gift of discernment, a gift of the clear overview, a gift of the ability to see the pattern, to see the wood and not just the trees, a gift of administration, a gift of clear decision-making, the ability to judge what is the right thing at any point and to get the priorities right. Those are real gifts, they're gifts of the Spirit. But it's quite likely that your besetting sins will be the colder end of the spectrum of besetting sins. It'll be being a bit judgmental, possibly being a bit dismissive of people, being not suffering fools gladly, expecting always from everybody else the same exactingly high standards that you set for yourself, that kind of thing. Now, the real problem is that when we get, we say, this Lent, I'm finally going to wrestle to the ground and get rid of my besetting sin, or whatever it is. The problem is we may end up rooting up or damaging the very gift of which the besetting sin is the corruption or shadow. That's why Jesus tells the parable of the wheat and the tares, do you remember? And the zealous, root and branch reform we need, make everybody right now. The zealous disciples want to rush out and tear up the tares, don't they? Straight away. And Jesus says, no, wait for a bit. The tares and the wheat are so close together. If you rush out there, you're going to end up pulling up the wheat. So there's this is what, coming away on quiet days and, spirituality and having a spiritual trajectory is about. There's a real discernment to do about how to gently weed, take the tares away without uprooting the weed. So anyway, I'm straight into a different image, but let's go back to the image. The need to re-envisage the zenith and glimpsed jewels of any gift mistakenly abased. To recognise that in the sin is an abased gift. And instead of asking yourself the question, what is it that I've done wrong and how bad can I make myself feel about how wrong it was? Instead of asking that, you say, what was the good thing that should have happened or could have happened? What was the good bit of me that was mistakenly abased? That's a completely different question. Then you deal with that, not by stomping on it and, tearing it out. You re-envisage it. You elevate it again from where it was abased. You cleanse the silted crystals. Yeah? And it's not for me to say, whatever the temptations were to tahini, but I'm guessing that, the danger of mistaking the wisdom of his poems for his own wisdom, the danger of thinking that that if your poem isn't any good at all, it's better than you are. Yeats, when he sat down to write the preface to his collected poems, he asks the question, when the poet speaks in the first person, it says, tread softly, for you tread on my dreams, or whatever the poet said. The poet can be, who's that that's speaking? And Yeats says, it's not the bundle of incoherence that sits down to breakfast. It's not me, messy Yeats. I'm trying to create order and beauty in cosmos. Somebody said about Tennyson, he was always carrying about in the darkness of his heart a little bit of chaos, which he was gradually manufacturing into cosmos. People sometimes write to me and say, I found your poem really helpful. I have the book by my bedside. Now here's my complex personal problem, perhaps you can solve it for me by reply. And I sometimes have to say, look, I really wish I could, but you've already had the best of me. Those poems are better than I am. I write them not because I knew any wisdom was in them, because I was trying to find it out. And, the poems giving me the phrase. So maybe the temptations of a guy at the level of healing might be to mistake his poems for himself, and perhaps to rest in his fame or whatever. So how do you re-envisage? Well, read poems as prayers. You can see that. Read your poem in the light of the Logos himself, of the word who gave it to you. Sit lightly to it, be humble about it. You can see all that following. Because obviously one of the best ways, if you're in danger of bigging yourself up or thinking too highly of yourself, is just bring God into the room and look at the comparison. That's prayer. Yeah? Very simple. Beautiful thing. I'd love to know who that guy was. And whether, like, supposing he had a plumber doing the confession, like, would he say, do plumbing as prayers? Maybe that would be incredibly important to the plumber, it's kind of, anyway, we don't know. But, so there's something beautiful going on there, if you like, are some phrases that feed my soul. I particularly like the need and chance to salvage everything. So everything is beautiful. There's nothing that you've lost or broken or erased that cannot be salvaged. That's the first thing. That's good news. Need and chance. Now, I hasten to say I know nothing about the ecclesial geography or politics of Felixstowe. So if I refer to certain kinds of churches, none of them is a church near you. But okay. So, but you can be exposed to a kind of theology and a kind of preaching which really knows about the need to salvage what's been erased. It knows a great deal about sin. It knows about the absolute depravity. It goes on to say that it thinks even the image of God in us is overthrown. And you get a real sense of your need for a saviour in preaching like that. But you also, if you're like me, sort of sitting in the back of the church, I think, well, I haven't got a chance. So I have need but no chance. But I can go to other places which are very nice and very warm and welcoming and very, but it's kind of like, if I go to say, look, I ruined my kaleidoscope. And they go, no, it's fine, it's not ruined at all, it's just great as it is, I just want to affirm you're my new kaleidoscope. I said, no, I actually need to do something about this. You know what I mean? I need both. If somebody tells me about the need to salvage something and gives me the sense that there's no chance of doing it, is just making things worse for me. But somebody who sort of says, well, yeah, you can salvage if you like, but it's fine in water, I need both. And here's this monk saying to him, spoke again about the need and chance. That's great. If I've got the need, I want the chance. So, the need and chance to salvage everything, to re-envisage the anything goes, Jules. So those are phrases that help me, and they said, read poems as prayers. And then comes this very beautiful image. I'll just say one last thing about before we turn to the thing I was really going to talk about, which was the George Herbert book. We've got the rest of this session to us to dive into George Herbert. I love this image of the fountain flowing, running. I love when he says over the page there, so pellucid, it never can be muddied. And I know that all light radiates from it. And it's the source of every source is source and origin. Now, I don't have good enough Spanish to translate this myself, although I read it in Spanish and my little bit of Latin is, helps me. But I've read 3 or 4 translations. And sometimes people sort of fouled or polluted or different words. He was the only one who used muddied. But, of course he used muddied, because earlier in his poem, before he gets to the St. John, he says, I plunged once in a butt of muddy water, but now I've found something so pellucid, it never can be muddied. So he's made the John of the Cross poem speak personally to him, which is what you should always make all poems do. Now, I love that phrase, it never can be muddied. Why? Because if you have ever been in this situation, which is just like a bad season of your life, where you think, I ruin everything I touch. Every time I try to help, it makes it worse. I end up hurting the people I love best. You can feel so bad, you think, like, I just spoiled stuff. You know, I wish I could stop doing that. You long for there to be something you can't spoil. For there to be something, as it were, that's upstream of you. And whatever you do doesn't pollute it. In fact, because it's upstream of you, it's unpolluted, it's so pellucid, it's flowing towards you. Yeah? And when I read this poem first, an image came to me. I don't know, maybe it's just my image, I don't know if it's really there in the poem. And I thought of myself, since this is as standing in a stream, looking downstream, with my back, as it were, to the source. The source is the spirit, the fountain welling up, all of these things, time itself, the gift of being, flowing to me from the true source of all sources, source and origin, yeah? The Alpha. I'm standing, I'm looking downstream. Downstream is the past. Why am I standing like that? Basically because I think we all, in a sense, most of the time, we sort of have our backs to God. We have to, that's why baptism involves a physical turning around. That's why we orient ourselves towards the east of the resurrection in a church. We have to, that's what metanoia, repentance means, to turn to face God. Now if you were, say you were very muddy and dirty and you kind of got yourself completely, sort of staggering around at the end of a rug now, you step into the stream, facing downstream. All you would see would be all the mud and dirt that's literally that moment just being washed off you. You'd see a kind of your own hazy reflection through dirty water. And if you thought that was the only way to face, you mistake that for who you really are. You're not that muddied reflection. The muddied reflection is only muddy because it's just been cleaned. Every moment of your life, the moment you're about to have now, when I start this sentence this way, comes to you completely pristine, unsullied, beautiful from God. And He speaks you into being because you are utterly renewed in every minute. But it doesn't take us long to screw up, and then which has been given, and we see. But then what we see is the mud washed away. And maybe this poem is calling us, although it is the night, to turn in the stream and just for a moment gladly welcome this fountain of complete grace and love that sees us in the light of heaven, sees us as we surely should be. And when it meets whatever has clouted us up, whatever life has thrown at us, or whatever we may even occasionally roll in ourselves, that's washed off. But we trapped with the image of what we have been, rather than the newness of this gift in every moment. In his lectures on the Apostles' Creed, Dogmatics in Outline, not very promising title, Dogmatics in Outline, but in parts on his chapter on the forgiveness of sins, simply begins with the sentence, when a Christian looks at the past, they're looking at the forgiveness of sins. That's what the past is. The past consists entirely of forgiveness. 7. When a Christian looks at the past, they are looking at the forgiveness of sins. That's the sentence of Bard. That's what the past is. It's the picture of your forgiven sin. But the present, C.S. Lewis says somewhere, the present is the point at which time touches eternity. The present is all this upward golden rays. If you can dwell in that moment as it's given to you, as the stream comes to you, you are clean and beautiful and new in that moment. So anyway, that's one of the things that particular river image does for me. So I only did that by way of a preamble, because I wanted to come now to this amazing poem by George Herbert, which is really the subject of our day. But I hope it might have got us into the mood for thinking about what poetry can do for us and for looking for those phrases. Now I mentioned, so George Herbert, just I expect most folk have heard of him. He's early 17th century. He's born in the late 1590s. He dies at the age of 42 in 1633. He was born into quite a sort of gentrified family. He was a sort of sideline of the Earls of Pembroke, but his mother was widowed when he was quite young, and Magdalene Herbert, she was brilliant. She was a really great intellectual of her age, and she was incredibly hospitable. She really knew how to entertain. And some people think, apart from all the spiritual layers, that in Herbert's final poem, Love, Love bade me welcome, and my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. But that delicate courtesy immediately sees anything that's troubled your guest. You come close, can I help you? What can I do to make you feel welcome and comfortable? Some people think he sort of saw that and learned that from his mother. One of his mother's great friends was the poet John Donne, who by then was widowed and was Dean of St Paul's. And she really looked after him in lots of ways. He wrote poetry. He often sent her poems before, they were shared with anybody else. And if you're a young wannabe poet, it's really helpful if your mum knows John Donne. So he had sort of around the house, given me a few tips, which is helpful. He went up to Cambridge as quite a young man. He did brilliantly at Trinity, so brilliantly that he was made a fellow of the college, more or less the instant he graduated. And then he got the absolute plum job in Cambridge, which was being university orator, which meant that, every time the king or great nobleman or visiting ambassadors or royalty from other countries came, he would be naturally taken to Cambridge and he would make speeches in their honour. So it gave you the best address book in London. And his mother, not unnaturally, felt he might be destined for great things. He and his young friend Nicholas Ferrer, who was in another family that was very wealthy and well invested in the city and so on, they were both being sent up to Cambridge really to be groomed for literary prizes. Herbert at Trinity and his friend Nicholas Ferrer at Clare. And then something happened. In the course of that time as undergraduates, they fell in love with Jesus. They really read and reread the Gospels. They had this tremendous sense of a calling to Christian service, which was the opposite of what was destined for them in a way by their families, which was all the literary prizes. And so they kind of helped each other out in making a radical decision that they would take orders as deacons to serve, and that they would serve in tiny parishes that might not otherwise have a priest at all. And Nicholas Ferrer went to Little Gidding and rebuilt the chapel and founded it there, and George Herbert went to Bemerton in Salisbury. And they kind of kept each other going. And then Herbert, became ill. He got tuberculosis. He sent the one manuscript of all his poems that became the temple by courier, just a man on a horse across from Salisbury to Huntingdonshire, to Nicholas Ferrer with a note that said, "This is a record of the ups and downs I've had with God, what's passed between me and my Lord." If you think it might help another Christian soul in their struggles of Christian life, then do feel free to print it. But if not, just throw it on the fire. And luckily for us, Nicholas Ferrer was a pretty good literary critic, and he thought, this would be good. So he took it into Cambridge a few weeks later, and it was published in Cambridge in 1633, which was the year that Herbert died, and it's never been out of print since, and it's continued to have sold. Amazing poem. So, and it's partly say he walked the walk as well as talking the talk. So he writes this poem called Prayer, and it's a sonnet. It's 14 lines, but it's a sonnet, but it's not a sentence. It doesn't even have a main verb in it. The verb implicit in it is the verb to be. So if you wanted to get the sense of it fully, you go, prayer is the church's banquet. Prayer is the soul in paraphrase. Prayer is heaven in ordinary, that's what prayer is. But he doesn't even give you the verb. He just cuts to the chase, just gives you the phrase. And I'm going to read it to you now, and just again, each of these phrases is a great image or emblem of what prayer is, right? And maybe as I read it, as they tumble over you, hold your hand out. Which is the gift for you? Which is the phrase that you catch? Don't think you've got to catch them all or juggle with them, or anything. Just, is the one that goes for you, one that speaks to you. Or alternative is the one you're going, what? Like, what is that? Like, how's that prayer? Then we can because these things I count them, I used to reckon it was 27, but I decided that the final phrase, something understood, is more like a summary of everything. So I think there are 26 distinct images, phrases that feed the soul about what prayer is. It's pretty good for a 14-line poem. I've now come to think that that's not an accident that it's 26, that it's like the letters of the alphabet, that he's saying you can combine and recombine these and make your own distinct and personal vocabulary of prayer out of these things. So let's see how it goes. I'll just read you the poem and we'll see what we make of it, and we'll start going into a little bit more sort of detail. So, prayer, George Herbert. Prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man, returning to his birth. The soul in paraphrase, the heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth. Engine against the Almighty, sinners out, reversed thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear. The 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear. Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manner, gladness of the best. Heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars, heard the soul's blood, the land of spices. Something understood. Isn't that an extraordinary poem? It's just, in a weird way, it reads as like quite modern poem. Yeah, it's like all this. There's all kinds of things going on in this. Sorry, I'm wondering.
No, it's fine. I would just.
Yeah, I should say hello to everybody who's seeing this online. Yeah, we have a wonderfully full and warm church. I hope you are full and warm wherever you are. So anyway, just in case I didn't say this earlier, I'm Malcolm Guite. I'm a priest poet, and I'm here in this beautiful Felixstowe church, sharing about George Herbert poetry and prayer. Right, okay. So, okay, amazing. Do you feel like talking? Now, these images, of which I count 26, because I think of softness and peace and joy and love, and this is all individual, separate things about what prayer is, okay? Now, if I can speak for a moment with my sort of professional poet hat on, what a poet means by an image with a capital I is something very particular. It's not just this sort of scenery flashing by the car window in a poem, just a little bit of verbal cinematography to keep you moving. An image is something which you know is coming to you already freighted with a precious cargo of meaning. An image, you know, is like, it's bigger on the inside than the outside, it's always going to keep giving. And you learn to recognize a great image when it comes to you. And frankly, you can wait quite a long time for it. You know, I keep showing up to my hut to write poems. I have a hut called the Temple of Peace, more in hope than expectation, but you know, it's the idea. And I think of it as my trysting place with the muse. And I show up pretty regularly, but in the hope that she'll be there. You know, sometimes I sit there for an hour and then I eventually go, no, this is not tonight, dear, I'm washing my hair, you know. Well, at least I try, you know. But I'll wait for an image for a month or two, and then when I finally get a great image, I go, yes! I can probably squeeze 3 poems out of this. Now, George Herbert gets 26 images, great images, in one go, and he generously gives them all away in the one poem. He says, there you go, I'm not even going to wait, just there you go. You know what to do with these. Go for it. Amazing. No wonder the first of these images is the church's banquet. That's exactly what you're going to get, banquet. And so you might stop to think, well, yeah, that's interesting. Prayer is the church's banquet. What's going on? Why might it be helpful for me to think of prayer, my own prayer life, as an invitation to a banquet, or enjoying a banquet? Well, there'd be so many things, wouldn't there? Particularly if you've got into a rut where you're feeling very dutiful about prayer, I'm going to say the daily office that kills me, whatever. No, think about the other way around. Somebody uses a sheer gift. Well, think about banquets, right? Because one of the great things is that somebody else has done the cooking, right? Somebody else has prepared the whole thing, and somebody else is going to do the washing up. All you have to do is turn up and enjoy it. And of course, a banquet is not a kind of little private indulgence. A banquet always has lots of guests, and it's usually held for a reason, to celebrate something. And there will be many courses, and somebody will have thought about the sequencing of the courses and made sure that if you've had something that was a little bit rich or fatty, that you'll have, maybe a fruit sorbet or something nice and, with a little bit of citrus in it to cleanse your palate and get ready for the next thing. And it's a sequence. And some things will be spicy, and then later things will be sweet, and so on, and there are wines to go with it. And if you're at a really good banquet, I've done extensive research on this in the hygienists of Cambridge. If you're at a really good banquet, you'll have a menu in front of you, have a card which you take home with you to record the feast. And you have all the courses and the wines written down. So you not only have the pleasure of each course, but you have the pleasure of anticipation. Some scholars think that the reason why the first image in this poem is the church's banquet is because the rest of the poem is the menu. You get all the other courses that you're going to be served, and some of them are quite astringent, others of them they're spicy, there's the land of spice. Just think about it. So that's great. You're out of the economy of task and work, and you're into the economy of gift, just receiving the gift. It's for enjoyment. Somebody else has paid for it, somebody you are going to enjoy it. And you're going to enjoy it in company, with good fellowship. And a really good, that somebody's thought about the seating plan at this banquet, and they've sat you in certain ways so that they can get the best conversation out of you and the people that are sitting on either side of you. That's what they've done. They've thought it through very carefully. Now you can take all of those things and think about how they might apply to prayer, about why we want sometimes to meet together in prayer, about why, rather than being a dull and mere rote thing, why not have a beautiful prayer that somebody else has really put together carefully and thought about? The general thanksgiving. The general thanksgiving. If you're stuck, then just kind of get the general thanksgiving as a takeaway, and open it up and enjoy it at the bus stop. The absolutely magnificent prayer tells more or less everything you want to say, and it's all been prepared for you. Doesn't make you less sincere. I'm not insincere when I enjoy a curry so I didn't cook it. You can think about set prayers as like a set menu. Enjoy it. Let it nourish you even as you give praise. Because obviously at a banquet, you naturally thank your host or hostess, which you're doing. So think of all this things I said might apply to a new way of thinking about some kinds of a prayer life. But remember, this is only 1 in 26, sometimes it doesn't feel like a banquet. But maybe you should let it be a banquet occasionally, and just taste it and savor it and enjoy it. I've had people say, when I've defended the Book of Common Prayer, saying, oh, you're just a literary guy. You only do it because you only like the Book of Common Prayer because you enjoy the language. And I'm going like, is it a sin to enjoy the language? Am I more meritorious and virtuous because I decided to read something written in flat, ugly English rather than in resonant? No. I think that's a legitimate pleasure. The church banquet. And all of that is without even considering what George Herbert probably thought was the most important element of his choice of the image of banquet to open his poem. And that, of course, is the complete biblical, scriptural, liturgical, sacramental setting of the banquet. You think of all the banquets, all the great feasts, the covenant meals, around the great celebration of the Passover, the Last Supper, and the fact that Jesus constantly referred to the kingdom of heaven as a banquet, as a great wedding feast. I will not drink this wine again until I drink it new in the kingdom. The first miracle is at the wedding feast, and it's a miracle of abundant generosity. 5 stone jars for cleansing, each holding however many firkins apiece it was in there. Somebody worked out something like 180 gallons of, the best wine. Not bad for a bottle party, it's very good. So look at all that, the resonance of that. And we'll see later on in this poem, there's quite a strong sacramental Eucharistic thing going on. And so it's the feast not only now, but prayer is that banquet which anticipates the banquet of heaven. And that's partly why he goes on to speak of angel's age later on after that. For a moment, when we share the Eucharist and the bread and wine, which is the foretaste of the heavenly banquet, we are doing it with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. We're coming to feast at that table. So that's just the one image. Now we haven't got, we've got to 11:30, haven't we?
We're starting again at 11:30.
Oh, right, so we'll break.
Have them have a break,
Yeah.
read it, go back and have a coffee. Enjoy the wonderful spread.
Well, speaking of banquets, okay, well, I'll just perhaps, I'll do one more. I'm not going to do every single one of these because we need several days. Okay. But let's just look at the second one together. In other words, the third one is the angel's age is another one. I'm happy to talk about that later. But let's go for prayer is God's breath in man, returning to his birth. Amazing, extraordinary. If you read a lot of 16th and 17th century poetry like I did, then it's sad but true, is you basically get tired of the very, very obvious rhyme that they all love to do, which is the rhyme of breath and death. Dee-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, my latest breath, dee-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum, and sing to death, just again and again. And it's like, breath, birth. I'm going to play with the sounds of breath and birth. What does it mean? I'll give you a little hint of it, we might pick it up after we've had a little break, but Herbert had the great good fortune not only to have this brilliant mother who entertained the wits and literary stars of the age, but also when she finally sent him to school, he went to Westminster when Lancelot Andrews was Dean of Westminster. And Lancelot Andrews was the greatest scholar of the age, he was the greatest linguist. He knew so many languages, they said at his funeral that he could have served as an interpreter general of confusion of tongues. He was the guy in charge of the Westminster College of Bible translators, and who were in charge of creating the authorized version. And Herbert learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew from him. So he knew, because Andrews had taught him, that in the two biblical languages, in Hebrew and Greek, there's a single word which means at the same time wind and breath and spirit. Ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek. And they didn't split those things up. Every breath was a kind of in-breathing and spirit. We split it up, don't we? Latin spiritus, it was the same. But we have two words, don't we? We speak of either inspiration or respiration. And one is spiritual and incorporeal, and the other is merely physical. It doesn't mean anything. Not true. We are embodied souls and ensouled bodies. We're both and not either or. Breathing and prayer can be the same thing, and they once were. There was a time when you couldn't draw a breath without it being the Spirit of God. You couldn't feel the wind blow without it being the breath of God. We just ruin this sometimes. I mean, everybody has their favourite and least favourite Bible translations. Obviously, I love Lancelot Andrews, who did that bit of Genesis translation, which says, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the deep. And when the New English Bible thought, how can we make that more? How can we deepen the beauty and resonance of that? And they say, a wind from God blew across the water. I don't think so. I mean, you have to be cloth ear to have written that. The Spirit of God. So they're all the same thing. Now what's Herbert doing here? God's breath in man, returning to his birth. I think Herbert is offering you, just in a couple of breaths that you can take together, the whole story of creation, fall and redemption, and of your salvation. What is the first breath? The first breath surely is that intimate moment in Genesis when God, having called other things into being with just a word, now gets personal and literally hands-on and molds the person out of the dust of the ground. And then he looks at this beautiful thing he's made, this beautiful creature that at this point includes both man and woman because it hasn't been divided up yet. And God breathes into this animal and they become a living being. The breath of life. So, I think Helen might be saying something like this. Prayer is God's breath, amen. You breathe in, and for a moment you stand with the first Adam in the Garden of Eden and say, God has breathed the breath of life into me. I'm alive and breathing because God wants me to be. He's breathed into me. Hooray! And then you think, oh, now how long can I hold my breath? Because this is a gift from God and this is my very life. And I have read all those poems that say that my latest breath, and sweet to death. And every last breath, every breathing out is an anticipation of my last breath. Do I dare to do it? How can I learn to trust God who breathed into me with this breath of mine, to give it back to him? Suddenly I'm no longer in the Garden of Eden with the first Adam. I'm at the foot of the cross with the second Adam. The one in whom all things are, all of humanity is gathered in him too. And he's coming to the end of his life just as Adam stood at the beginning. And what does he do? He says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And he breathed his last breath. So now I can stand with Jesus and I can just breathe out. Say, thank you for the gift of life. I'm going to let it go back to you. I know you're going to keep it for me. Now, I once heard somebody describe Holy Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. This still strange pause and poise between the sorrows of Good Friday and the joys of Easter. It's almost as if the earth is holding its breath. And I thought, that's kind of right, but not quite right. And then I suddenly realized, no, what it is, it's as though the heavens are holding the earth's breath. Everything, all our life has been breathed back to God, and now we're in this poise. And then on Easter Sunday, he rises again, and he gathers them together in the evening, and what does he do? He breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit. He breathes on them. It's the new creation. You know that's going to happen in John's Gospel, because John's Gospel is a riff on Genesis. It's about the new creation. It starts in the beginning. So I think God's breath in man changes breaths. As you know, breathe in. Oh, thank you for my physical creation, the particularity of my body, the whole business of being here. Help me share this common atmosphere and keep. Then I breathe out and I say every night, into the hands. And when I breathe my last, and I will trust him to hold it, because I'm doing it in and with Jesus. And then on every Easter, I breathe in and say, this isn't just my biological life, this is Zoe, this is life indeed, this is the resurrection life, starting even now. And you wouldn't have to say a word, you could just do it while you're waiting for a bus.